The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Michelsen of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar. Afghanistan's humanitarian crisis, the way forward. Afghanistan is on the brink. Since the Taliban takeover in August 2021, insecurity has given way to a humanitarian catastrophe. After years of conflict, today the Afghan people, impacted by drought, COVID-19 and an imploding economy, face cold, starvation and displacement, as well as declining rights and freedoms under the new regime. The situation demands a global response. Can the international community veer away from politics and view the crisis through a broader lens? Will it make a consolidated effort to help the Afghan people through humanitarian, logistical and financial aid? And will the Taliban never honor their pledge to reform, thus reducing the risks of a mass refugee exodus and spreading extremism? To discuss these and other crucial issues, please join our panelists, bringing your questions, comments and insights.
Hello, welcome everyone, wherever you are in the world, for this rather grim Democracy Forum debate on a country that we've returned to many times over the years, one whose people were once given a vision of accountable government and security, and now face a humanitarian winter crisis of unimaginable proportions. Afghanistan, a humanitarian crisis, the way forward, is the title of our debate. In the summer, our television screens were filled with the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Now the news is headlined with the consequences and the high-stakes conundrum for Western democracies. How to help the Afghan people without helping, legitimizing, or formally recognizing the Taliban government. Or why can't they? And what about the less democratic regional powers, Iran, Turkey, Russia, China, and then India, which traditionally is one of the biggest providers of humanitarian aid to the region? How do they and the West work around the barriers of legal rules brought in through sanctions against the Taliban? These are very difficult issues, politically and morally, and we have a knowledgeable and hardened panel to give us insight. Christine Fair, Timor Sharan, Lynne O'Donnell, Arne Strand, Jean-Paul Faguet. Summing up will be Democracy Forum chairman Barry Gardiner, a British member of Parliament who has witnessed firsthand in his constituency the plight of those fleeing Afghanistan and of the loved ones left behind. But to begin with, we go to Democracy Forum President Lord Charles Bruce, who, as with all the Afghan and other debates, will lay out the canvas for our discussion today. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Since the West's flight from Kabul in August last year, the dire warnings voiced by the United Nations and by many other international development agencies of the very worst that could befall Afghanistan and its people during the winter months have tragically come to pass. While our webinar today addresses the unraveling humanitarian crisis, our panelists will be focusing their attention on finding a way out of the current situation and we're very grateful that they have agreed to share their thoughts with us. Despite the wide range of issues affecting democracy and human rights in the Asia-Pacific region, which are all worthy of our attention, I think you'll agree that it is vital to continue to shine a spotlight on the plight of Afghanistan. And I'd like to thank the team at the Democracy Forum for arranging this event and for the continuing editorial response of Asian Affairs magazine, our sister publication. And as always, on your behalf, I thank Humphrey Hawksley for agreeing to chair the proceedings. With a falling currency that has dropped by 25%, Afghanistan is now officially the poorest country in Asia and is now fast becoming the world's worst performing economy. Caught in an economic trap that has allowed it to become over-dependent on imported food, Afghanistan faces the bleak prospect of wide-scale starvation this winter, where 98% of its population is receiving inadequate nutrition, and where UNICEF estimates that over 1 million children may perish. The military chaos left by the departure of the United States and its allies from Kabul 5 months ago has quickly translated into economic chaos. Overnight, the Afghan government lost 80% of its funding, while its central bank reserves of $9.6 billion, equivalent to half the country's GDP, have been frozen, thus paralyzing the banking system and leaving 300,000 public servants, including doctors and teachers, unpaid. The crisis has extended beyond Afghanistan's borders as people affected by conflict and economic uncertainty have sought sanctuary in neighboring countries. Established at the beginning of last year, a UNHCR program of protection monitoring in 32 provinces of Afghanistan now estimates that 2.9 million people are internally displaced, while a further 2.2 million are registered as refugees in Pakistan and Iran. With the collapse of its financial institutions, the IMF estimates that Afghanistan has suffered an economic contraction of at least 30%, and where its per capita income has declined from $500 to $350, indicating that over 90% of the population has already fallen below the daily poverty line of $1.90. Every day, we are witnessing the gradual collapse of one system, says Abdullah Dadari, the United Nations Development Programme Head of Mission, interviewed in December. The banking system, the health system, education, water, sanitation, all of these systems are failing one after the other. The largest single concentration of foreign reserves allocated to Afghanistan is held within the World Bank's Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, the ARTF, which had a cash balance at the end of September last year at more than $1.5 billion. Donor countries enabling this trust fund have now agreed recently to transfer $280 million to be spent by UNICEF and the World Food Programme. A statement issued by the World Bank last month confirmed that ARTF funds will enable UNICEF to provide 12.5 million people with basic and essential health services and to vaccinate 1 million people, while the World Food Programme will be able to provide 2.7 million people with food assistance and nearly 840,000 mothers and children with nutrition. Such a programme will not be sustainable, however, without the cooperation of the Taliban government and the support of the international community. A recent policy paper published by United States Institute for Peace, USIP, recommends other initiatives such as shoring up the banking system by replacing lost foreign reserves, expanding sanctions relief to small businesses, resuming paying the wages and salaries of key public sector employees, and the gradual release of foreign exchange reserves to offset the balance of payments crisis. The Norwegian Centre for Humanitarian Studies also suggests that there is room for more constructive engagement based on dialogue. Cooperation on the ground is more likely to produce changes in practice than formal denunciations and demands. Well, clearly, this is a very grave situation in the state of flux, and I look forward to learning how our panelists perceive the future for this benighted country and its long-suffering people. Well, welcome to the seminar, and please pass your comments and questions to the panel, and I'm sure the panelists will be delighted to answer them for you.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. Systems unraveling, wide-scale starvation, despite dire warnings, all in your analysis just now, and to find a way out. That is what we're going to try to do. As Lord Bruce said, please put in your comments, questions into the comments section, and they will be relayed to the panel to answer or to react to. Our first speaker is Dr. Christine Fair, Professor of Security Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Fair has served with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, the American War College, and the Center of Conflict Analysis and Prevention. So she should be able to find a way through. Dr. Christine Fair, what is the other way apart from the old ones that haven't quite worked? The screen is yours.
Well, I'm going to start by disappointing you. I don't think there's an obvious way forward, but let me first begin explaining the sources of my pessimism. So for people who haven't, been Afghan history buffs, the fact is that this problem isn't new. It goes back to the 19th century, right? And why do I say the 19th century? Well, when Afghanistan, or perhaps we could say the early 20th century, when Afghanistan essentially entered the Comity of Nations, it entered the Comity of Nations as a rentier state, which is to say it couldn't pay its own bills. Prior to wrenching itself free of British suzerainty, the British overwhelmingly paid the recurring costs of the Afghan government's security requirements. And when the Afghans decided that they were no longer going to be a fealty of the British said, fine, you better figure out how you're going to pay for yourself. And then the Afghans had to slowly find an alternative way of subsidizing their state. And eventually Russia and then the Soviet Union stepped into that breach. So by the time the Russians left Afghanistan following the signing of the Geneva Accords, only about 35% of the recurring costs of running the state was being paid for by the Russians. In contrast, this enormous state that the United States and its NATO partners built, there has never in history, in Afghanistan's history, been a history of a state that's this enormous. And as a consequence, the vast majority, and by vast majority, I mean well over 90%, usually north of 95%, was paid for by the international community. And of course, the lion's share of that was being paid for by the United States. This was not a state building apparatus that was based around the needs of Afghanistan in 2002, or much less in Afghanistan that would exist in 2022. This was a state building effort that was driven by the domestic compulsions of the different troop contributing countries. Most people don't understand that in the total amount that went to Afghanistan, which now well exceeds the entire amount spent on the Marshall Plan to reconstruct post-war Germany, that the vast majority of those monies came back in contractor fees. These contractor fees, they were the contractors that provided security, they were defense contractors, they were development contractors, they were contractors sitting in the Afghan government performing the services that ordinarily a civil servant would provide. And while their job should have been a skill transfer, and in other words, working themselves out of a job, why on earth would you do that when most of the expatriates, while of course enduring the security constraints, actually were making a very lucrative living? They were making money far in excess of what their qualifications would have fetched in their countries from which they came. So this has been a longstanding problem. It's William Byrd, who I believe is the work that you cited, sir. He's been one of the few of us, maybe there's a handful of us, that for the last 15, 16 or more years have been really dismayed by the inability of the international community to focus upon economic sustainability. What happens after the troops leave? If you actually go back and look at William Byrd's work on this issue. By the way, he's the only person at USIP I will trust. USIP I have renamed the U.S. Institute of Pakistan. Everyone else working in their South Asia shop is pretty much a hostage to Pakistan and the money that they have to expend there. And of course, Moeed Yusuf, who is now Imran Khan's national security advisor, he was being paid by the US government for over a decade while he was lobbying for Pakistan there. But if you go back and you read the archival information that William Byrd has put together, every time there was talk of a US pullout, he again raised the tocsin that this is going to be an economic disaster. And then when the threats of withdrawal receded, so did any interest. But the nature of this collapse, the lack of international attention until it actually happened, coupled with, quite frankly, this ecosystem of corruption that was built by the international system, but also benefited an enormous number of Afghan elites, essentially artificially inflated the price of what it took to run that government, right? If there hadn't been this enormous inflation and corruption from the contractors, from essentially the lateral payments, I guess that's the euphemism, to get things done, we don't know what the real price of paying for this government would have been. And it really doesn't matter, because even though Ghani came in as a specialist in these affairs, right, he had this institute on fixing failed states, he didn't do anything of the sort. And when in fact he, ferreted his way out of Afghanistan on his helicopter, he also reportedly absconded with some fairly handsome sums as well. So this isn't a new problem, but as you noted in your introduction, when the Afghan government collapsed, all of those foreign subsidies that were keeping this rentier state afloat abruptly stopped. Right. So as you said, the ARTF wasn't able to issue payments to pay the civil servants, not all of whom are Taliban. I don't know to what extent, and we probably won't know because transparent data, independently confirmable data probably don't exist on whether or not the Taliban honored its pledge to keep the civil servants in place. But even if they did, they can't be paid, right? So we have this enormous problem. And the international, I'm not going to regurgitate the details on the dimensions of this human rights catastrophe. I'm going to just try to keep myself focused on the perils and the conundrum that faces the international community. So how do you aid and abet, or how do you aid the humanitarian crisis to relieve Afghan immiseration without abetting the Taliban? And that's essentially the crux of the dilemma. You ask some very, logical questions. Why can't countries like India provide aid? Well, the fact is, India in and of itself could never provide aid because Pakistan would never grant it overland routes. Pakistan, from the beginning of this conflict, this isn't the first time. I mean, this famine in Afghanistan is not new. It has been going on for well over a decade. It's that news of the conflict always crowded out news of the famine. Pakistan never let India transit food products, and India had actually took its excess wheat, made these highly nutritious, I'm not sure how delicious they were, but nonetheless highly nutritious cookies, for lack of a better word, to distribute to Afghan children in particular. In Pakistan, no, we're not going to let you transit over route through Pakistani territory. And so this was why the Chabahar port in Iran was so central to Indian interests, right? Because through Chabahar, it could offload Indian relief and then transit those goods into Afghanistan. But the Chabahar port had always had a carve out under Obama because the sanctions on Iran, there was a caveat that as long as the investments were going to aid Afghanistan, there would be this carve out. It wasn't clear when Trump withdrew from the JCPOA and the snapback sanctions whether or not that carve out would be honored, and it looks as if it wasn't. In any event, whether the Trump administration would or would not have honored that caveat, investment in Bahar completely split. So this is where we are. I'm a national security scholar, right? I'm not primarily someone who focuses on humanitarian issues. And I locate the problem squarely on the Taliban and their Pakistani enablers. Pakistan, I mean, even if you look at that most recent convoy of, I would say, a very niggard sum of relief that was sent by Saudi Barbaria, Pakistan insisted upon being the vector of delivery to make it look as if they were the ones that were diminishing Afghan misery and suffering when they've actually been the primary immiserator. And the Taliban themselves do not want this aid to go directly through aid organizations because it wants to be able to have its share of the grift. And it also wants to be seen as trying to help the Afghans when in fact it doesn't have the capacity and it's never had the interest. If you go back to Taliban 1.0, you'll remember the reason why they blew up Bamiyan was because the Taliban were pissed that UNESCO was interested in giving money to basically restore Bamiyan to its original condition. And they're like, screw your Buddhas. And they, with ISI assistance, blew them up. Right. So this has not been new. This has been a crisis that should have been anticipated. While I am not a fan of basically opening up and making available the Afghan government's monies, I'm not a fan of that because I don't think the Afghan Taliban will spend it on its people. I think it will spend it on itself and its weaponization and so forth. But no matter what you think about restricting those monies from the clutches of the Taliban, one of the side effects has been this enormous liquidity crisis. There just isn't money. You can't even send money to Afghanistan by the Hawala network because the Hawala network basically depends upon liquidity and there is none. So no matter who you are affected by the liquidity crunch. And then, of course, the Taliban's own policies have really exacerbated this immiseration by not allowing women to work. People forget, that there are a lot of Afghan widows, right? I would venture to say most families have not been spared the brutalities of this war that actually goes back to 1973. So I have to be honest, every assessment that I've read has a number of very serious holes. But I think the fundamental conundrum facing the international community is how do you aid Afghans without abetting the Taliban? And I don't have any, what I would say, robust or even defensible propositions to put on the table to do that.
Thank you very much for that. Although you've given us a no obvious way forward, you mentioned that 95% was paid for by the international community, most of that by America, more than the Marshall Plan. In the past 20 years, the international community has changed a lot in its makeup and different countries have got different powers. So are we going to see a different narrative on nation building, conflict stopping, whatever you want, with Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, India? I mean, are they going to think of it through a different prism? Is there any new way forward by that, or is that a pipe dream?
So, I mean, what the Chinese principally want, and I don't know if your participants are aware of this. The Taliban have had long-standing ties with the Chinese. Prior to 2001, there was reportage that they had actually inked a memorandum with the Chinese, and the Chinese were similarly close. Literally on the eve of 9/11, Chinese were with Al Qaeda.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, if you go back and listen to all of various Osama bin Laden's musings, he never once condemned or even critiqued mildly China, even though at that time, what it was doing in Xinjiang and also Muslims who were not Uyghur, right? It was well known what China was doing. Of course, it wasn't engaging in what we would now call genocide, taking their genetic information to harvest their organs. I mean, even Hitler didn't do that. I mean, it is
sorry to sort of.
But what they want, what the Chinese want from the Taliban, and what the Taliban want from the Chinese is, quite frankly, much more doable than what the U.S. NATO wanted. The U.S. NATO wanted to build this somewhat functioning democratic-esque juggernaut that would be funded by our contractors. What the Chinese want is just enough security that will allow it to get the vast resources that have been known to exist in Afghanistan since before the Soviet invasion, right? It is the largest single most investor. And without having access to the ring road, its investments in Gwadar are quite frankly moot. So, and the Taliban, of course, are quite interested because, Afghanistan could pay for itself if you could get these resources.
So just to encapsulate that, it's better, is it not, that China gets involved on that basis to make Afghanistan secure for its investments, that it's left to be a free-for-all as it is at the moment with no money and no sort of security at all? Is that Chinese option a better option than we have now?
So I will say I have always held that view, and this has really rankled my colleagues in India, because if you think about all of the countries that are adequately risk averse to doing the kinds of dangerous work. I mean, look, building the Karakoram Highway is an example of the risk acceptance of the Chinese, whereas even the Pakistanis themselves didn't lose as many people. The Chinese overwhelmingly bore the cost of human life in building that thing. So the Chinese are, of all the international community, they're the least risk averse, and I would dare say the most risk acceptant. And they stand to benefit enormously. So the Chinese, they have really, they locked in those investments very early on, and they weren't able to get them out of the ground. So I'm of the belief that this might be the only option forward.
So we've got a fraction of a way forward. Just before we let you go, John Elliott has asked, I think Pakistan agreed a few weeks ago for India to send wheat via Pakistan to Afghanistan, that they got blocked. Can Christine tell us whether it has been solved or might be? Could you sum that up in a couple of seconds?
It has not been, and it won't be. Pakistan has never let India make these transits. Why? The reason why Pakistan is singularly obsessed with the Taliban being in place in Afghanistan, is to keep the Indians out, right? The Indians were winning. And the Pakistanis aren't going to give the Indians any wiggle room for even the slightest of victories. No, it's not going to happen.
Christine, thank you very much. I know you have to go off and teach and lecture, so stay with us as long as you can, and then thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Timor Sharan, Executive Director of the Afghanistan Policy Lab, which models social, economic, and behavioral situations to come up with a better way forward. We've had that fraction of the Chinese way forward now. Dr. Sharan is going to share his findings with us about the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. Timor Sharan, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have spoken enough about some of the challenges that the country has been facing on the humanitarian and economic front. I straight go to some of the solutions and way forward discussion. Now, for me as an Afghan, the key question that we all have to ask ourselves is that, will the UN again making its biggest humanitarian pledge for Afghanistan in January 2023? So are we going to be in January 2023 talking about the same issues? Because with the current band-aid effort to address the economic and humanitarian crisis in the country does not seem very sustainable for Afghans. No Afghans waking up in the morning and aspires to line up to get food. We need to get people income and job, and get the economy running, starting. And the biggest question for Afghans, how long will this misery go on? And is everyone doing everything they can to end this misery? Now, Afghans want to have jobs, dignity, access to education, and privileges, and access to privileges that they had in the last, some of the privileges that they had in the last 20 years. So 2 points from my point of view. One, on the US and international side, we should do a lot more. The US should show more political will and leadership in helping resolve the banking and liquidity crisis that was highlighted by colleagues. The banking, as rightly pointed out, the banking and financial liquidity crisis due to sanctions, and of course, some of the challenges around money, remains the most persistent bottleneck for the delivery of emergency relief and NGO operations in Afghanistan. And to be honest, I do not see this being resolved for foreseeable future with the current pace and discussions around around sanctions and liquidity crisis. We really need to think about seeking all the options that are on the table to get money inside the country. To date, Western Union, MoneyGram, and other cash services such as the Havalas, the informal transfer system to Afghanistan, has not been sustainable to respond to the magnitude of the crisis. None of the international and international and national NGOs have access to their full balances in their Afghan banks to pay running costs. Almost all of the organizations that I've talked in the country rely on some sort of hawala. And the problem with hawala is they're expensive, it's not sustainable, and it's not possible to scale up. From my conversation to various international and national organizations, at the moment, one of the ability of international organization, national organization to deliver cash for work aid is only around 5,000 households at any given time. And that is not enough for the scale of the problem. The commitment, financial commitment, is there. 2, the Taliban should demonstrate the ability to govern and make serious changes on a number of fronts. 1, on rights, particularly women's rights. In the midst of a humanitarian crisis, what is the Taliban signaling to the Afghans and to the international community? That their priority is not addressing the economic and humanitarian crisis that the country is facing, but in fact, how to please Afghan women, how to please civil society, media, and others. And that is absolutely problematic. Half of the population is not able to go to work. Significant number of girls are not able to go to school above primary school, and not a single Muslim country around the world has done this. So we ought to open the public schools, universities, and allow women to go to work. On political rights and governance, so far, a lot of restrictions on women, civil society, media. And what they need to do is to allow freedom of assembly and expression, to enable media and civil society to function. At the same time, we need inclusivity at all levels, not in the civil service, not just in the civil service recruitment, in the cabinet, but also in ensuring that the judiciary is represented and it recruits the best and the brightest of Afghans and reflect the diversity of Afghanistan. They ought to work with communities and shuras and give people voice and representation. Every single day for the past month, Afghan women bravely go to the street and demonstrate in Kabul and major cities. What happened in Faryab province in the north last week shows that the fragility of the new regime, especially given the exclusiveness to inclusion, to bringing in diverse group of people. Now, on the economic front, and that's my last point, and revenue collection. Now that the Taliban are in the government, and they seem to be claiming that they're collecting a lot more revenues because they're less corrupt somehow, and they're effective, they need to be transparent with the Afghan people. Where does that money go? If they're collecting a lot more revenue compared to the previous, to the Republic government, then where does that revenue go? There needs to be transparent about that. Why are not they paying the teachers, the salaries for the teachers, nurses, health workers, and so forth? I think what is happening is a lot of criminality and entrenched criminal networks taking advantage of the situation on the ground. And the more criminal groups are entrenched, there will be more disruption and the possibility of localized conflict at all levels. So this is not necessarily a dividend that the Taliban are saying with security, with them now in power, security has improved. Now, in terms of quick solutions, the shipment of cash, US dollar for humanitarian purposes needs to be scaled up, because the current level of getting around $19 to $20 million per week through UNDP to Afghanistan is absolutely penniless, nothing compared to the scale of the problem. Expanding sanction reliefs and clearer guidance from the US so that private companies could move in and take more risk in getting the money to the country is important. We also ought to explore other ways of using e-money through mobile phone and others that we have done, humanitarian organizations have done in Syria and Yemen. And I think those are key issues that we need to address. Happy to come back and discuss some other issues around civil society and human rights aspect of the humanitarian crisis.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Timor. I just wanted to, if you could encapsulate this money flow problem for us. The money that was bankrolling the Afghan government before came from the international community, the US, and that has that been frozen, and that can't come through, and sanctions is stopping how much? So could you just sort of pile all that up for us in a ABC?
Sure. So 3 points here. One is that the Republic relied, 40% of the Republic's GDP relied on international aid. And significant amount of Afghan money went towards fighting the Taliban. So there has been a stoppage, complete stoppage of international aid in Afghanistan. So around 40 to 50% of GDP is gone. As you pointed out, we are, as IMF and other World Bank has estimated, our economy has seen 30 to 35% traction. Now, second, $9 billion Afghanistan has in reserve banks, New York banks in the US. That money has been frozen because of sanctions. And of course, the Taliban hasn't done anything on that front because they have brought in individuals who are on the sanctions list as cabinet ministers and so forth. The US is unlikely to freeze that money for various reasons. And thirdly, there is just not enough money. We cannot print money. The contract has ended because of the sanctions. We cannot print money. I do not agree with Christian here that there's not enough money in the country. I think there is some money in the country. There were a lot of money accumulated through criminality and illegality, illicit economy. That money is in the country. And what we are seeing through Hawala is a lot of that money getting out of the country. Okay. A lot of Afghans are desperately trying to get the money out. So there's not enough money going inside Afghanistan to pay salaries, to pay NGO workers, government staff, and so forth.
So basically, the money that's needed to help people through the winter is caught in a political stalemate. And so it's a political imperative that is stopping that money getting through. even though it's going to a government that doesn't know how to handle it or might steal lots of it or the rest of it. It's still that political imperative of freezing it that is stopping the money getting to Afghanistan. Is that
yes,
right?
and in addition, partly, yes. And in addition, the Afghans are only allowed to withdraw 5% of their closing account. So if I have $10,000 in the bank, I can only withdraw per week around $500, nothing more. If I have $1,000 in the bank, I can only withdraw $50 of my closing. And that goes with Afghans, with international NGOs, with national NGOs and others. And we have an economy that relies heavily on cash flows. It's not a credit economy where my salary would be paid through the banking, so I could then make payments through the banking system for my groceries. Everything is cash-based, and I think that is one of the biggest challenges.
It sounds like a complete nightmare. There's a question from Francis de Souza, which any of the panelists can tackle if they want when it comes up. Will the debate address the role of the UK and the USA in creating the foundation of the Taliban by arming Hekmatyar in the 1980s? And does this impose a special responsibility to provide significant humanitarian assistance? Can I just throw that as a yes or no quick answer to you, Timor, before moving on?
Well, as an Afghan, I have to say our dreams are shattered. One of your colleagues earlier mentioned that we gave a vision of democracy and a better life for Afghans in 2001. Not even going to the 1980s and what happened during the Cold War and how the US, UK, and other countries supported the Mujahideen and created this Islamic movement and Islamic organizations. Of course, my colleagues are better placed to answer this question, but from an Afghan point of view, this has to be a shared responsibility. Yes, as Afghans, we take responsibility for what went wrong in the country, but I think significant part of it is because we have never been, including when Professor Christian Fair talks about rentier state, we were never being given a chance and a space and time to move beyond the rentier state and build an economy that is functioning based on reality of Afghanistan and the strength of different sectors and potentials that the country has. That was never there for us. And I think largely that problem, that responsibility lies with Western countries. And at the moment, what frustrates us is this washing their hands off and saying, well, it's now Afghan people's responsibility, especially the Biden administration's narrative in the last a year, that it was the failure of Afghans and that the Afghans didn't fight. And it's just not a fair analysis given the complex geopolitical situation dynamics that was in place with our neighboring countries and everyone interfering there. Even now, that clearly largely Pakistan seems to be in control. They doesn't seem to be doing a very good job of governing that part of it, or enabling their clients to govern that part of the world. Anyway, I leave that to my colleagues to answer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Timor Sharan. It's a great insight there. And now we are moving on to Lynne O'Donnell, a journalist, correspondent, magnificent stuff in foreign policy in the past few months and other magazines. She headed up both the Agence France Presse and Associated Press Bureau in Afghanistan and has covered the country, I think, for most of the past 20 years. Lynne has seen this crisis unfold from the grassroots villages to the decision-making corridors of power. And Lynne, I think you are going to be addressing us on how the Taliban is handling or repressing the media and the impact that has on the humanitarian crisis. The screen is yours.
Thanks, Humphrey. That's a very kind introduction. I do think that I'm the only journalist who was there in Afghanistan when the Taliban were pushed out of power by the Americans, and there again 20 years later when the Taliban returned and the Americans turned their lights off at Bagram and snuck away in the middle of the night. So it has been a very long arc. And I was there on the ground for the last 3 months of the war, covering the developments and the rollout of the Taliban battlefield strategy from across the country, from front lines across the country, as you said, for foreign policy and for other publications as well. And I think, and I was on the last commercial flight out on the 15th before the Taliban came in, purely coincidentally, but quite fortunately, I think I was working very closely with my friend and colleague, the Pulitzer Prize winning Afghan photographer Masood Hosseini, and we left together, and we were very relieved that we did. But I think what I've seen in the 5 months since then is an awful lot of revisionism, especially in the first couple of months when there was really very widespread shock about what was going on and the scenes that we were seeing, and the failure of the NATO allies to properly and thoroughly look after Afghan people who had worked with them, and even to get their own people, passport holders, their own citizens out of the country. It was a huge schmozzle, and there's only a few countries in the alliance that I can think of that did a good job, France being one of them, Germany the other. Everybody else just patted themselves on the back for a job not very well done at all. And now we've seen, as we've heard from Christine and Timor, it's all closed, it's all over. The revisionism that I'm referring to is really about the state of affairs before and after the Taliban. Starvation, poverty, violence, ethnic disparities. It was all pretty bad beforehand. Every single year, the WFP, UNICEF, whoever, said that however many million people, that last year it was 11 million people, faced food insecurity in the winter months. They'd put their hands out, they'd ask for more money, even though they'd been there for decades. So, why wasn't the situation better? The FAO has been there for decades as well. So why are Afghan farmers still unsustainable and haven't been able to grow their way out or produce their way out of the drought that has prevailed, as we've already heard, for 10 years? In the area of the media, which I've been very interested in for many years, I wrote my MA dissertation on it as well when I was doing a war studies master's a few years ago at King's. I have followed my colleagues in Afghanistan's media space very closely and with great awe and respect, to be honest with you. The way that all started was, the money flooded in after 2001, and some funding went to set up magazines and news agencies and newspapers, etc., radio stations, TV stations. But it was really between 2010 and 2015 that we saw an enormous amount of money, $1 billion US, poured into specifically developing the Afghan media space. And so far too many newspapers, magazines, radio stations and TV stations than the market, if it was a true market, could sustain. But it wasn't a true market, as we know. But what we did have was the embedding, if you like, of a sensibility of what free media and freedom of speech really means. And if you look at a global map, Afghanistan was pretty well on its own in the region, surrounded as it is by the Central Asian states, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, China also borders it, Iran, Pakistan. In none of those states can we see even a skerrick of free media. But Afghanistan was a real light. And some of the people that I worked with in the bureaus that I managed and was bureau chief of, Agence France Presse and Associated Press, as you said, Humphrey, were amongst the best journalists and the bravest and fiercest journalists that I have ever worked with. And this was magnified every time I went out and met my colleagues in Afghanistan's media. And I think that they did themselves proud and they did their country proud. And they weren't just starting off from ground zero. 100 years ago, Afghanistan had a free media. And even though that's been an up and down history, the concept was certainly embraced and with great pride. And I can say that I am only full of great admiration for Afghanistan's journalists. All that changed not on August the 15th. It changed with, I think, specifically, if we want to point on the timeline, with the agreement that was signed between the Trump administration and the Taliban on the 29th of February 2020. The Taliban were emboldened. They got everything they wanted. They continued to be the world's biggest drugs dealing cartel, a criminal entity. They also took control of a large slab of the mining sector in Afghanistan, producing and smuggling mining, everything from gold and coal to lithium and lapis lazuli, precious stones, you name it. So a criminal cartel, misogynist killers and liars. They did not comply with any of the conditions that they had agreed to in the deal with Donald Trump, who was desperate to end the so-called forever wars. What they did do was escalate their attacks on the Afghan security forces and embark on a vicious assassination campaign against civil society, government ministers, professional women, judges, police, military leaders in Kabul and other cities, and journalists. And journalists were specifically targeted and killed. And so over the last 2 years of the existence of the Republic, journalists flooded out of their profession in fear of their lives and in fear of the lives of their families and under pressure. And they stopped working in media and stayed in Afghanistan, or they left altogether. So, a huge brain drain out of the media sector. It was very clear over the last 3 months that I was covering the war that media were being specifically targeted in areas that the Taliban were taking over. So they go into districts. The way the strategy unfolded was very obvious if you cared to take notice. And I don't know whether any of the people who purported to be our leaders at the time really took any notice, because they certainly didn't do anything about it if they did. The Taliban started with the border crossings, then they started to take all the districts around the provincial capitals, and then they moved into the provincial capital, starting with Zaranj down in Nimruz. And it went from there. And when I was in Herat with Massoud in early August, we essentially watched the city fall. And it was then that we decided on the date that we would leave, the 15th of August. But we talked to a lot of journalists in Herat at that time and across the country beforehand. And the Taliban were taking over local media organizations, either closing them or, in the case of radio, for instance, taking over radio and absorbing it and pushing local journalists out. By the middle of August, there were safe houses and hostels all over Kabul that were home to journalists who had fled into Kabul from all over the country. And people that I interviewed and talked with and just met and hung out with were pretty clear at that stage that they wouldn't be going home and that the jobs that they had wouldn't exist anymore, and they were just waiting for the end. Everybody knew that the end was coming, and it was only a matter of time. So I think it is fair to say that while there's been a lot of revisionism in other sectors, that what happened with the media happened in real time, and we could see that it was happening. It ended, and a free media has ended. Very, very difficult to build, and it took, as I said, $1 billion and a lot of time to build no time at all to destroy. And the impact of that has been that a lot of the information that is coming out of Afghanistan now is coming through social media, which I don't really think is a trustworthy, these are not trustworthy forums for us to really gather salient and relevant and trustworthy information as you can, I think that you can with journalists more often than not. And this has given the Taliban, I think, impunity to do what they do. So we are seeing on social media, for instance, reports that people are going missing, they're being killed, they're being detained, taken into custody with no charges, disappeared. And there is no outlet for holding the Taliban to account or shaming them for the behavior that people are doing in the name of the Taliban. The Taliban's not united or unified in any way, shape or form, but the name Taliban is being used for a lot of the to justify a lot of the atrocities that we have seen in the past 5 months. I won't go on for too much longer. I hope that some people have questions for me, but I will say that easy to destroy means it will be very, very difficult for us to see a rebuilt free media in Afghanistan in the short to medium term. And we are going to have to rely more and more on social media for information that comes out of Afghanistan that tells us any skerrick of what is going on. I'm a little bit worried about that also because of the way social media is now being used as a pretty toxic space, to be honest with you. An awful lot of the diaspora, the people who were forced out of Afghanistan with the changes on the 15th of August, are traumatized. They are being forced to take refugee status wherever they are, which many of them don't want or need to do. They are unsettled, uncertain, upset, and they're turning inward and they're turning on themselves. And I see that Twitter Spaces, Facebook, other social media platforms are becoming pretty toxic. So what are we going to see out of Afghanistan? I think the question is, how can we trust the information that we are going to see out of Afghanistan? It is, there's a lot of fake accounts. There's a lot of trolling. I'm still trolled. I've been told not to go back. I think dead is not the right word, but certainly media in Afghanistan is very sick indeed, and it's heartbreaking, I think, to see that the Taliban and their backers in Pakistan, China, Iran, wherever else, have really got their way. It's now, the light is off. It's a dark space.
Lynne, thank you for that depressing account of $1 billion that's just sort of vanished. Can you draw a picture for us before I move on to Arne Strand? The frozen money we're talking about, the food supplies, getting stuff through. If there was a flourishing media in Afghanistan, that message would be getting to the politicians in Europe and in the US and that, in order to push things and make them happen. To what extent do you think that those institutions in the West and other donors are responsible for looking through that and saying, right, there is no media there, but we have to act and we can't just react to the headlines? Or if you could give us a picture of that.
Yeah, I think that the United Nations agencies have operated without accountability and with great impunity in Afghanistan for very, very many years. UNICEF, for instance, collaborated with the Taliban in areas under its control in recent years on handing them school curricula, for instance, because we've got to get the kiddies in school, and with polio vaccinations being handed over. And we know very well that the Taliban has not been great supporter of vaccinating children against polio in either Pakistan or Afghanistan. So, there has been no accountability. The World Food Programme bragging about the tens of millions of people that it is now feeding, but there are people who are complaining about the inedible quality of the food that is being given to them by the WFP. In my view, there is no illegality in not sending the money from either the World Bank Trust Fund. We heard about the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, of $1.2 to $1.5 billion still held. Now, that money was put aside for development projects that had been agreed already with the Republic government. There is a legal process to be gone through before that money can be unravelled from those already agreed contracts and reassigned, albeit in Afghanistan. And so what's happening at the moment is that World Bank donors are having discussions at very high levels with senior leaders of the Taliban to release money so that it can go to, for instance, pay teachers' salaries. The health sector is different. It was already largely contracted out to NGOs. So the $280 million that was released from the World Bank Trust Fund in December is already going to pay the salaries of people who are working in the health sector. Because it's going through the NGOs. Now, the education money is different because most teachers in Afghanistan were and should be and are employed by the state. And so the money for their salaries has to go through the government. So there is the dilemma. The legality of the sanctions cannot be underestimated. We cannot say, oh my God, why not just release it? Because it's not that easy. But talks are going on. And really, if I wanted to donate to make sure that Afghan families were going to be receiving food over the next couple of months, I'd do some goddamn homework, do my due diligence and find those small grassroots Afghan organizations that exist and have existed for a long time and that are without overheads, without corruption, without 1/3 or however much it is of their money going to the Beltway bandits of yore. They're getting money to people who need food and sustenance. So do your homework. If you want to help, money is getting in. It is getting in. And don't worry about the sanctions. It's a legal process that we should be supporting and talks are ongoing. Just do not give money to the Taliban because they steal it.
Can I just, before I let you go, Francis D'Souza asked another very good question. It seems that the Taliban are exercising their philosophy unevenly. Is it the case that in some areas there are degrees of media freedom and girls' education, and that this is a result of a very divided Taliban force?
Well, I think that they're really good questions, and they come really from the disparate information that we're receiving. The Taliban is not a unified force. It is divided factionally, and right at the top of what passes for governance, we see a rivalry between the Haqqani network, which is controlled by Siraj Haqqani, who is the Interior Minister, the head of the Haqqani network, and a sanctioned, blacklisted terrorist according to UN Security Council and US law. And he's probably the most powerful man in the country. On the other side of the fence, we have the so-called Qatar faction, that is Doha faction, that is run by Mullah Baradar. And they're all jostling for power and handing out the spoils of war, if you like, to their supporters. One of the reasons that we're seeing there is no media freedom, that's just not part of the equation. Girls are going to school above age 12 in, I think, 6 of the country's 35 provinces. But we're seeing a lot of lip service being given to women's and girls' education, for instance, and giving women their jobs back, because at the upper echelons, the Taliban know that these are the conditions that the international community wants to see fulfilled before, for instance, money for education is released. So those World Bank partners that I mentioned before are in discussions with the Taliban about the equality of education. It's a condition for releasing that money to the education system. Let girls go to school at the same time and on the same conditions as boys. So yeah, there's no unity politically, socially, or geographically amongst the Taliban, and that's also part of the problem.
Thank you very much, Lynne O'Donnell. I'm sure we'll be back to you to find out what your way forward is going to be at the end. But we're now going to Dr. Arne Strand, Deputy Director of the Norwegian Christian Michelsen Institute, which among many areas, it looks specifically at the best ways to distribute Norwegian aid. His doctorate expertise is in post-war recovery studies, and he will share with us his thoughts on how to engage with the Taliban and meet the humanitarian challenge. Dr. Arne Strand, tell us what you know.
Well, thank you very much first for being invited into this discussion and to address some of the really big challenges that Afghans are confronted with now. I'm faced with a bit of difficulty because Timor Sharan actually addressed a lot of the issues and that I've already was thinking to speak about, and in a much better way than I ever will be able to. But I'll go into some of these issues that might have not been addressed up to now. But first, I'd like to take us a bit back because, as has been stated before, there has been no doubt that this humanitarian crisis that has been building up has developed over a number of years under then what was the responsibility of the previous Afghan government led by Ashraf Ghani. But what is less being focused on, and which is part of my concern, is that it's not only a humanitarian crisis that has brewed, it's also that the poverty has gradually increased in Afghanistan since 2014, despite all the billions that we just spoke about being injected into the economy. A part of this can be explained by corruption, but not all of it. A part of it is also explained that some of the priorities of the international community was probably, as was also stated, going more towards the military buildup and the war on terror than it actually was allocated for the building of the state and towards the building of the governance and democratization of Afghanistan. So let's take that as a basic start. I think the main issue is then really how can we now get funding into Afghanistan? The international community, because of the sanctions, has agreed that there is somehow a possibility to fund what is defined as humanitarian plus, that can include not development assistance per se, but support for education and for health. So the development space that could actually have done something about the poverty is also something that needs to be kept in mind already now to be able to meet some of the challenges. Yes, the Hawala system is probably functioning better for smaller NGOs than where a major amount of funding needs to get in. Some funding is coming in dollar-wise with the UNDP, but Timor Sharan is very correct that this is not sufficient. But two more things, because we can't then somehow overlook the private sector. The private sector needs access to funding, and even if it's available inside Afghanistan, the restrictions are also equally imposed on them of getting access to the funding. This all relates to the sanctions and how those are applied. I've worked with Afghan NGOs since 1988, 89. And toward these comments of possibility of utilizing them, yes, absolutely. They have often better grassroots control and influence than a lot of the international NGOs, though that vary. The dilemma is that a lot of the leadership in the Afghan NGOs were evacuated or left Afghanistan in August. There is not the capacity on the ground, and that goes the same for the UN agencies, actually on the implementation of some of the humanitarian project, even if the funding gets in. So this really need to be addressed on how to do it. Then a bit more nuance. I surely agree that part of the dilemma now is to really to both assess the information getting out of Afghanistan and verify it. What we are trying to do is, with a research project of having Afghan researchers going to different parts of Afghanistan now, to get some feedback on what is really going on in the provinces and in the communities. And on the positive side, just to bring that up, there is less war. There is not 10,000 being killed every year. That implies, for at least for the international agencies and for the UN, it's possible to move. It's possible to move people. It's possible to move. If it's wheat or other sources, it's possible to do project. It's possible to do development project as well. Interesting from Faryab, I know there was things going on there recently, but the NGOs that we have just recently interviewed are welcome. Girls' schools are operating up to the 12th, 15th grade. Women project directly at them are continuing. And the reason to this, and this is not only because Taliban are divided, it's because the local population demand education. And that differs from different parts of Afghanistan, where when they are putting under pressure, this is exactly the same we saw during the 1990s when we operated and supported girls' education there. Local pressure, Taliban approved it, Taliban accepted it. So there is a positive side as well, where you can actually reach out, where you can do it. And then look at the Taliban administration. Is it the Taliban administration, or is it a continuation of the previous administration? It is the latter, primarily, in the districts, but with the Taliban at the top. But that means there is a professional capacity in Afghanistan today that we deliberately have built up for the last 20 years that actually can take on more of the responsibility. I think Timor is spot on when he thinks about the ability of the Afghans to avoid further aid dependency. But then there is also the need of recognition that there is a state structure in place that you need to rely on, and you need to engage with, and you need to be able to develop further. Because if that collapses, even at the moment, if it's under Taliban control, there is nothing left. So what is happening at the moment, and what is worrying me, is that the alternative then is to build a separate aid state. And we know that that is, from research and history, is not sustainable of different reasons. It's expensive. Local population hardly have any influence on it, and it has a tendency of maintaining itself over time. It will make it extremely difficult to move from purely humanitarian assistance and going in to meet some of the development needs. What Afghanistan needs is a more economic development, more people at work, addressing some of the major reconstruction problems that is at the moment. And you can build roads, you can do a lot of things actually to put people back into work. But then you need to be able to move beyond the limitation of education and health. But if we move on, because I think there have been recent developments, even if it's the EU that has promised limited support for the education sector for the next 2 months. But there is a promise to pay teachers salaries, which is a major development to me, because that means that there has been some talks with the Taliban that has allowed that funding to go through. And that is bringing cash into the economy. It's bringing possibilities for having a completely different discussions with the Taliban on actually, no, there is a funding here. Education needs to go on, girls needs to come back. They can't stay on there, but we don't have funding for it. And they can be challenged, on the other hand, to say, but if you have gained your funding from different sources of income from taxation, which they would like to do, spend it towards the Afghan population. Don't spend it on further arms or anything like that, which they probably don't need because the US left so much behind. But it's this engagement. So, and I think also to bring in some of my experience from the last round of the Taliban, where the international stand was a very principled, rights-based approach, where there was a lot of sanctions put in place, primarily then led by the UN as a principled approach. This divided the aid community. Some follow it, others didn't follow it. And it increased the tension all the time towards the Taliban and didn't change the position, which was the main point. It actually hardened their position because they felt that they were put under pressure. While at the same time, when we worked in the field and engaged locally with them, we could make a lot of change. They accepted, like I just said, girls' education up to 12th grade in central Afghanistan. They accepted a Swedish committee to run girls' schools all over the country. And they gave in because there was a local pressure for it, and the local community could, to a certain degree, hold influence on controlling the use of the money. So are we now missing a chance of actually engaging with them? I think so. I think there is a need. You don't need to go into a recognition, but there is a recognition that there is at the moment no other alternative to the Taliban. And then I see it as better as enter a dialogue with them, making them accountable, have a dialogue to shift their position, saying that yes, we, according to the Quran, girls should have education, remind them of that as we did 20 years ago, and actually continue to push on that, but create this dialogue. It will allow us also an understanding of what the Taliban stands for today and how that can be moved. And I think we also need to keep in mind that there are different positions within the Taliban, and some of them need possibly some time to shift. Some might seem too radical at the moment. How do you facilitate that without ending up in a complete collapse of Afghanistan, which I think is the worst situation at the moment? I've witnessed as the destruction of Kabul during the 90s. I don't want to see that again. It's fragmentation of the country, and that's a place where we will have no influence. That will be the place where the Islamic State, to a larger degree, can nurture their networks and be a threat internationally. So there are some, even if we don't like the Taliban, and I think there is hardly any way except trying to engage with them, trying to shift the position, not for the Taliban, but for the Afghan population. So maintaining at least a minimum of an active state role is also then where we need to have that kind of engagement. It's also because there is a way now to save some or to secure some of the investments we made in Afghanistan for the last 20, I would say 40 years on supporting the Afghan population. So the alternative could be, and that's where the references to China, Russia, for that sake, Pakistan comes in. They might be willing to engage with the Taliban government on completely different ways than we would like to have that engagement. I think there is a larger opportunity for the Afghans to engage, to be part of that discussion, if we try to engage them more broadly with the discussion with the Taliban government as well. So there are some extremely challenging dilemmas, but at the bottom of it, it's at the moment to ensure that there is not a mass starvation in Afghanistan over the winter, and B, that we acknowledge that there is such a poverty issue, partly because of failed states, failed international donor policies, that should allow, in the end, as Timor Sasha, to find a way that actually can sustain Afghanistan financially for the future. And that's not on Poppy, it's not on those illegal means, but it has to be something else. We haven't managed that for the last 20 years. There's a lot of educated Afghans now that should contribute to this discussion, how this best can be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arne Strand. If I could, this might be too complicated to answer, but with your expertise on Norwegian aid specifically, and you talked about that being involved since 1989, can you give us an idea of exactly what projects or types of projects Norwegian aid is being spent in now, how much money is being spent, and how that changed after August?
Yeah, Norwegian aid is, I think it's only constituted 2% of the aid that has gone into Afghanistan for the last 20 years.
Okay.
Of course, but so much of it was primarily from the US, and so much of it was directed primarily for the military purposes. Norway's assistance was in the range of 750 million a year. Now it's down to the half, and it's directed towards the humanitarian sector. But I think there is another dimension here that's quite interesting, because quite early on, and that's probably also because of former President Ashraf Ghani, there was an insistence and an acceptance that aid needed to be channeled through the Afghan government to be able for the Afghan government to build their capacity. So a lot of that was actually done so, except from the US that channeled most of it outside of the government. But I think this is where we have seen some fruits of it as well. There has been a capacity building of an Afghan state with a lot of civil servants that is very capable of running the countries. So my concern now is that a total collapse of these kind of functions will set Afghanistan back.
But is Afghanistan, I mean, because the Christian Michelsen Institute looks at Norwegian aid in total around the world, is Afghanistan your biggest problem, or do you have other problems like that? I'm saying that because when we get to Jean-Paul Faguet in a couple of minutes, we are going to widen this thought out. So where does Afghanistan rank in the problems of distributing aid?
I think it places itself squarely into the dilemmas that the international community is faced with in what we often define as fragile states. And it's the challenges is equally large now. We can take Somalia, we can take Syria. A lot of places where there is an ongoing warfare, where there is strong international interest or military interest, and where there is a state then somehow is struggling, and where the international community often revert to the use of humanitarian short-term assistance before it. But it's clearly something that Afghanistan somehow, what was different with Afghanistan was the collapse of the state.
Yeah.
Okay. And all the discussion that brought about, and how we are going to address it now.
Thank you very much for that. And as I said, I mentioned that because we're now going to Jean-Paul Faguet, Professor of Political Economy of Development at the London School of Economics. He looks at institutions and organizations that underpin development and transformation. And much of his studies have been in Latin America and elsewhere outside of Afghanistan. So I've asked him to widen the debate into how to build responsive and effective democracies, if that's even the right word, in developing countries. It didn't work in 2001, so what would work now? And what lessons that can you bring to the situation in Afghanistan now? Jean-Paul Faguet, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And thanks to Lord Bruce and the Democracy Forum for the invitation to join such an illustrious panel, which honors me. I've got some slides, so we'll just go through them quickly. As Humphrey just said, I'd like to broaden out and talk about effective government and also effective politics in developing countries in ways that lead to better governance and hence faster and more comprehensive growth. I'm not an expert on Afghanistan or that region, so I'm trying to bring lessons and insights from a broader literature. The ideas that I'll be putting forward come from this book, and next slide, please. Also, these two papers in those journals, if anyone listening would like to probe deeper, and if you are going to probe deeper, the place to start is with the last one in that Journal of Democracy paper, which is the broadest one that looks at the broadest range of countries, and then maybe map it back through the other two pieces. Also, the website linked at the bottom is something that some colleagues and I built just in terms of expertise as a public good to disseminate all of this plus a great deal more in terms of interviews, databases, etc., on which we base this research. So next slide. Yes, thank you. Let's start with effective government. I want to start with a simple static or structural model of government in a developing country before moving to a more analytical dynamic model. So next slide. The ideas here are really straightforward. I don't pretend that any of this is hugely original or controversial, but I think it is useful to put them all down in one place in a simple schematic form and consider how government happens, where it comes from, before we then turn to why do some places, either some countries or within a country, some regions or some cities, have better or worse quality government. So there you see in this figure the institutions of government in the middle of the figure. In a democracy, they are controlled by those officials are populated by politicians and their allies of a party or a coalition that win an election. So at the top center of the figure, you see political parties and politicians. They're involved in two quasi-market relationships. To the left, with their constituents, with whom they exchange promises about policies and actions they will take if they're elected. Vote for us and we will do X, Y, and Z in exchange for votes. But then to the right, political parties and politicians don't run on air. They need money for their campaigns and for their operations. Where do they get the money? Well, for the most part, in developing countries, political parties get their finance from firms and other economic interests in exchange for ongoing policy influence and influence over decision-making, assuming that they win and take power. This is intrinsic in the way that democracies work. It's something that is, in my view, not acknowledged often enough, partly because it's seen as a bit dirty, as a bit suspect. And I think that it probably should be seen as something that has potential certainly to be suspect, but it's built into the system. So when you run an election, one party or coalition wins power, they take over the institutions of government, and then there's a second order dynamic of interaction between those governing officials and those institutions of government and civil society organizations. And the exchange is downwards of services, policies, and actions by government in exchange for information as feedback from citizens and citizens groups, civic organizations, information as preferences. We want this, we need that, we need government to do the following for us. And also in most developing countries, some level of counterparts. So it seems odd to say this sitting in London, in such a rich, sophisticated city, but in many, if not most developing countries, especially at the local level, if local people want a school built or a road resurfaced or flood defenses erected, they're going to have to provide some services for free. They're going to have to volunteer some labor or some simple building materials like stones and sand. Next slide, please. So far so good, but that's sort of a descriptive model. That was a descriptive model of how government is constituted. So how can we explain more analytically why some governments are better and others worse? Well, the thing we're trying to explain is here on the right-hand side, government responsiveness and accountability. Why are some governments more responsive and more accountable? And it seems to me, and the lessons of the research of lots and lots of people who have looked into this across the developing world and also in Europe and North America, is that the first order causal factor that explains that is an open and substantively competitive politics. In a democracy where politics are more open, freer, fair, and more competitive on substantive issues, meaning issues that people care about, like education or health, equality, rights, etc., as opposed to beauty contests about which politician has a prettier smile or sort of trivial factors. Where they're open and substantively competitive, you tend to have more government responsiveness and accountability. But that substantive competition, that openness, these are not given factors. They're not given by God. They're not baked into the geography of different countries or different regions. They are themselves endogenous to two other factors, which are much more fixed or change much more slowly over time. At the top, economic interests and the way that they engage with politics, and at the bottom, civil society's organizational density. So it is simply true, even within a country, that if you look across localities, some places are densely populated by lots of civic organizations, and others have fewer, or they have civic organizations that take on a different form, that just look different. If we can have the next slide, please, and the one after that, please. So, thank you. So, where you tend to get a more open, substantively competitive politics is in places where you have a more diverse and heterogeneous set of economic interests that are providing that political finance to parties and politicians. Different firms, landowners, other individuals who are rich enough to finance political activity who care about different things. And so some firms may care, for example, about having a more educated workforce. And so they're interested in politicians that pledge to improve primary education, because by the time they hire people, they don't want to have to teach them to read. They need workers that are numerate and literate. Whereas large landowners, for example, may not be interested in that because they prefer workers who are illiterate, because then they can hire them as lower wage landless laborers on their farms. These are real examples from real countries. And so when you have that more diverse set of economic interests, they will tend to support different parties, different movements, different sorts of political expressions. And then on the lower side of this figure, where civil society has many active organized groups that can aggregate what people want and what people need upwards and represent those needs to political parties, then you tend to have more open, substantive competition. If we can have the next slide, please. And where a more diverse and heterogeneous set of economic interests interact with civic organizations that are active and aggregating upwards individuals' and families' needs and wants, where these two sets of forces interact via the political system, you'll tend to have substantively competitive politics that then leads to responsive and accountable government. If we can have the next slide, please. And so now I'm super summarizing. I don't expect this to be completely understandable because I'm just going through it very quickly for lack of time. But if I summarize some of the results of this stream of research, it's that neither economic interests, which is what the lobbying literature from the economics discipline tends to stress more, nor social forces alone, which is what's stressed by political sociology and comparative politics, neither of these by themselves can explain local government performance or the performance of different national governments. It's rather the interaction of both sets of factors. You have to study the interaction to explain the outcomes, understand why some governments are more responsive or more accountable and others less so. And the quality of politics appears to be endogenous to these sorts of interactions. Next slide, please. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is effective politics. What are the characteristics of developing countries' political systems that tend to lead to more effective politics? And by effective politics, I mean systems that are stable over time, that don't tend to lapse into crisis, and that tend to represent adequately the needs and wants of the people in that country. And so I take you to cleavage theory, which is a seminal contribution by Lipset and Rakan, that says that political party systems in any country, developed country, Switzerland, Germany, or Bolivia, Bangladesh, or Benin, should reflect the underlying cleavages that define a society if they are to be stable and representative of that society. And so some examples of these sorts of cleavages are in most of Western Europe and North America, for example. Political party systems for over 150 years have been based in one form or another on left versus right, where the left is pro-workers, pro the interests of poor people or ordinary middle and working class people, versus on the right, the interests of capital, the interests of business, a smaller state with lower taxes, etc. That makes sense because these countries' social cleavages were largely given by the Industrial Revolution and the transformation of the economy that ensued. In other countries, the main cleavage that defines a society may not be that. It may be ethnic differences or religious divisions in places like South Africa or Northern Ireland, for example, developing countries and even developed countries or developed regions. We could have the next slide, please. So let's do something very simple, which is to draw a wonderfully, horribly simple representation of a society in a circle, where I'm representing a major cleavage that divides that society between two groups. Now, obviously, this is hugely simplifying. Any individual is a mix of characteristics, let alone at the societal level. But just to be clear and simple, let's focus on a society that has two major groups, the pink dots and the blue lines. And the pink dots and blue lines could be labor versus capital, left versus right, or it might be the northwestern highlands versus the southeastern lowlands, or it might be Catholics and Protestants, or Muslims versus Buddhists. It could be very different things in very different countries. Next slide, please. So how do you organize a political party system that is stable and representative in a society that looks like that? Well, if I were the benevolent planner designing a political system, I might draw this sort of horizontal line across it and say we're going to divide this into the top versus the bottom, and the upper bit might be, for example, people who care about left versus right. Let's say people who care about workers versus people who care mainly about capitalists and the interests of capital. If we could have the next slide, please. Somebody else might come along and say, no, actually, the main cleavage is religious, and so let's draw a line that says it's mainly about Christians versus not Christians, or Muslims versus not Muslims in this particular country. Next slide, please. Either of those two cleavages, or any political party system that was attempted to be constructed along the lines of those blue lines, would tend to fail and would tend to not be very effective in this sort of country that looks like that. Only the thick black line would match the society, where let's say that the society is characterized by a cleavage between northeastern highlands people versus northwestern highlands people versus southeastern lowlands people. people who live in very different environments, different temperatures, different soil fertilities, which then lead to different sorts of economic activities. They might have different outlooks on life, because in the highlands people tend to stay indoors all the time, and in the lowlands people are outdoors because it's hot and humid, etc. So it's just life is very different, and this maps onto a set of political and cultural attributes. And the political system that is going to govern that country and aggregate the needs and provide services for those people needs to match that social characteristic. And the political party system, it's not just one party we're talking about, it's an array of political party systems, an array of political parties that propose policies that cross that divide. So the divide, the political cleavage is a divide that should be reflected in the composition of parties, and hence in the platforms and the political positions that they put forward to voters to hopefully vote on. If we can have the next slide, please. So to give you an example of why this matters, in one of those papers, I analyzed the case of political party system collapse in Bolivia, a country I've spent a long time researching. And the super summary is that initially Bolivia had inherited from the 1952 revolution a left-right political party system. It's its own particular Bolivian version of a left-right system that simply did not match the real cleavages that dominate in that society, because Bolivia never had an industrial revolution. And so it's a country with very little industrial capital, where people work very hard, but you don't have a self-identified group of people who think of themselves as workers or the working class or a labor movement. There was a labor movement, but it was small. It was a small minority. It's about 4% of the population, so very far from representing the majority of Bolivians. A particular institutional shock occurred in the late 1990s, which then led to that collapse, to challenges to that left-right political party system, which, because it did not match the society that it was attempting to govern, then collapsed. And those parties are gone forever. Those parties are never coming back. And a new politics arose, led by a new political party, the MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism, and its paramount leader, Evo Morales. So many of you know about Evo Morales, who have heard about Bolivia's first indigenous president. What's important is not just him and his personality, although that's part of the story, but it's what he represents, which is the collapsing of the previous system and a reconstitution of a new politics, which is based around identity, around whether you're from the Western highlands or the Eastern lowlands, about whether you're indigenous and what languages you speak and the traditions and religious observances that you have in your family. If we could have the next slide, please. And so what this looks like, the sort of thing I'm describing, is political competition as dimensional replacement. Bolivia went from having a left-right system, which would be this red and blue circle on the left, to having a very different sort of system based on ethnic identity. And when you got that dimensional replacement, so in this simple-minded figure that I've drawn, a shift of 90 degrees of the main cleavage in the circle from north-south to east-west, it makes all the previous political parties completely irrelevant. All of those leaders who invested for years, decades, parties that invested for generations in fomenting platforms, in articulating ideologies, in trying to reach out to voters and gain their adherence along a particular dimensional cleft, that is wiped off the map, and it's replaced by new parties and new leaders who say that left-right stuff is irrelevant. The reason that we're where we are now is that none of that ever mattered for Bolivia. What matters is who you are, the language you speak, and what you look like. And so this is why Evo Morales was able to ride this wave so spectacularly successfully in Bolivia. And so let me close the last slide, please, with the only thing I'm going to say about Afghanistan, because as I'm not an expert, and my colleagues on this panel are, I want to just pose some questions. What does Afghanistan society look like? What sort of political system should best match a society that looks like Afghanistan looks? And then what sort of democracy should be designed around that? I say designed in a very loose sense, because I'm not assuming that foreigners, Americans, Europeans, or anyone else should come in and design a democracy for any country. But at some level, it has to be done. So in analytical terms, what sort of democracy matches the society that Afghanistan is? I don't know the answer, but if I attempt a couple of quick forays into this, Well, the left-hand graph is something that we tend to see a lot in the West, which is an ethnic map of Afghanistan. Many people in developing countries get offended when Westerners arrive with ethnic maps and call this colonial, neo-colonial anthropology. You know, we in the West always look to tribes and sort of atavistic characteristics of developing country societies. No, I don't know. It's just it's one possibility that this sort of thing, Pashtuns versus Baloch versus Tajiks, etc., maps on to deeper characteristics that people do adhere to and that does shape their lives. On the right of this slide, you see a completely different alternative, which is an economic geography approach. This is a satellite picture. So this is from the Nightlights project. And so this is a real NASA satellite photo of Afghanistan in the 2000 teens, so before the collapse and before the Taliban took over that we've been speaking about. And what you see is that there are almost no night lights in Afghanistan. You can just about make out the borders of the country. You can see Kabul there on the right. It's that brighter dot inside the country. There are a few other dots, and the rest of the bright dots are actually in bordering countries, in Pakistan, in Iran, or in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. So what sort of political party system matches a country that looks like this socially or looks like this economically? Christine mentioned at the very beginning that the state that the West built was super proportioned. It was exorbitantly large in historical terms. This suggests to me that it's exorbitantly large in economic terms, and a couple of the other speakers have mentioned this also, that it was the sort of thing that could never be sustained once foreign aid ended, as eventually had to happen, because you simply can't expect it to go on forever. So these are a couple of the questions, but I do want to underline that the political party system that a country has is not sort of random, and it's not simply local color. It does need to map onto something real that describes what the society looks like, if it's then going to generate a politics that leads to effective governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul Faguet. I will withhold my own curiosity, because that was a great sort of overall presentation now, but I want to give to you one of the questions that's come in from our audience, and then I'm going to give a question to each of the panelists in the next few minutes. This is from Nadim Shah, and because of your experience elsewhere, Jean-Paul, if the Taliban, or if any government in control, continue to fail to provide for the Afghan or their people with basic needs and rights, can they be held accountable under international law?
Oh, that's a really difficult one, and I think I don't know the answer because I'm not a lawyer, so you need to speak to an international lawyer about that. I think a government, the Taliban government that fails to provide for the needs of its people repeatedly over time would lose legitimacy internally as well as in the international space, and so they would be subject to international action of one form or another, either positively in terms of more aid or negatively in terms of sanctions and other forms of criticism. But can they be subject to international law, as in could you have an international legal process against a country that fails to provide for its people? Well, sadly, the suggestion from many other corrupt, ineffective, and violent governments around the world is no, not really. They're much more in abundance than there are cases of the opposite.
Okay. Can I ask the next one to Timor, Sharan? Will this humanitarian crisis leave a generation of young Afghans unequipped to compete in a global environment? That's from Philip Bowman.
Oh, the answer is absolutely. Some of the best and the brightest have left the country since August fall. They are in camps, in desperate situation. Sorry, my kid is at the background crying. So in desperate situation, trying to resettle, they essentially will be losing, a significant amount of time until they are resettled in those host countries. But in Afghanistan, we are facing a major brain drain, no doubt.
That's another question from Prashant Kumar, if I could just interrupt there. Is Afghanistan's brain drain reversible in the foreseeable future? And will this, along with the removal of women from so many spheres of life, condemn Afghanistan to a perpetual humanitarian crisis?
That's a very good question. Yes, and my fear is this is going to be a major challenge. I don't think we are there yet in terms of saying this is irreversible, but we are definitely in a critical place where the best and the brightest are not really working, are not being used, including for the Afghan economy, including half of our population, 50% of, essentially around half of the population, 50% of women are not able to work and go to work because of the restriction and limitation imposed. So that's a major challenge. And let's not forget, the best investment international military intervention in Afghanistan did in the last two decades was human capital. Significant number of Afghan leaders went abroad, studied in the West, came back and served their country, including myself. So the country is now losing this generation of people. Of course, this generation of people, let me be very clear, was also responsible for some of the problems that we faced in Afghanistan. But if I may, Humphrey, just quickly come back to this question of Arne. I think that's a brilliant question. It builds on Professor Jean-Paul's lecture. I do believe, as someone who has worked as a deputy minister for local affairs in Afghanistan, local governance, I do believe that the political system that we have historically inherited in Afghanistan does not currently reflect the realities of Afghanistan's societal structure, both in terms of ethnicity and also in terms of tribes. And going back to Arne's question, brilliant question, what we inherited in terms of the Afghan modern state was what we inherited by the British. The British paid significant sums of money to Abdurrahman Khan in 1890s to come up with an iron fist, to create a very centralized political system in the country that everyone else, whether the former communists, the liberals, and everyone else built on it, including the post-2001 Americans, made the mistake of coming up with a very centralized political system that did not give voice to the Afghan people, to communities, to tribes on the ground, and that created serious tension. And I think one of the key reasons that the Republic lost the war was because the voice of Afghan people were not reflected. And the current mistake that the Taliban is doing, if they continue to expand their influence beyond Kabul with the current political system, will also likely to see fragmentation of Afghanistan.
Okay, thank you for that. Lynne O'Donnell, can I give two questions to you, if you could wrap it up in a concise answer? Rimjin Sud, inclusive government must be at the heart of a stable functioning Afghanistan. Will the Taliban ever take this on board, or is the current exclusionary regime too much controlled by the Pakistan military, which has a vested interest in Afghanistan being a failed state? That is the question, not a Democracy Forum statement. And also, could you bring into that Ajay Pratap Singh Rator's question? India has been one of the biggest regional donors to Afghanistan's infrastructure and institutional development. What might be the future of this development cooperation under the Taliban? Lynne, thoughts?
Yeah, I'll take the second question first, because I was just speaking with a Pakistani diplomat who's a friend of mine here in London today. And I think that it is fair to say that Pakistan has washed its hands of any responsibility for what is going on in Afghanistan. There are people who are on the record in the past 10 or 15 years who have said that they were supporters of the Taliban, funders, armors, whatever, and that the takeover, most recently in Owen Bennett-Jones' excellent BBC radio program, that the takeover of Afghanistan was an implicit aim of Pakistan's intelligence and military establishment. I think that, denials aside, their involvement and responsibility for what has happened in Afghanistan in the past, well, let's say 5 months, but certainly 20 years.
I was going to say 20 years, yes, plus.
no matter how much they deny it, it's a fact. And while the Pakistanis are going to be dealing with their own problems of terrorism, which is really spiking over the past year, has really spiked, and economic implosion because their economy is it's in a very bad shape. They fear terribly the probability really of an influx of more refugees over the Torkham and Spin Boldak borders, because they will have to look after them financially and territorially. But where does India come in on that? I think Christine went into that in detail earlier, that Pakistan is not going to give any brook to, and through the Taliban, is not going to allow India to be proactive on any level in Afghanistan.
That's literally getting the planes across the airspace. It's a logistical issue.
Everything. Everything. But for a long time, India was the biggest donator. You know, it had $1 billion, and it was soft power infrastructure, building. Medical, you know, they had doctors based there. I think that's all over. Yeah. Listen. And the first question, what was it?
I think we're running out of time. So if we could leave you there, because I've got Peter Cornish has a question, which I want to give, if Arne Strand can answer this in 30 seconds or less. Big question. Given the current circumstances, how can the world support self-reliance rather than dependency for Afghans in the long term? I'm asking you that, Arne, because of your aid expertise.
No, to me, that is the core of the question. But just one comment on Pakistan, because I haven't experienced one Afghan who is not want to be independent from Pakistan. So I think whatever Pakistan think they can hold an influence on Afghans, I think they are wrong in the longer run. And that same goes for the Taliban. And it's a bit now with this discussion on local governance. To me, the governance in Afghanistan is extremely important, and there are well-established communities locally. Enabling them, working with them, ensuring that assistance goes not only to them, but with them, is one way of ensuring the sustainability of it all. And that is why my worry of then having a kind of aid channel through the international system that is not being made accountable either to the Taliban, but to the Afghan population. They need to know what aid is coming through. They need to hold an influence on that. Then they will ensure that it's used in the best possible way. Then they will step on and use their own resources. That is in the longer run.
Okay, because we have to move, can I leave that thought, is that the local government is the sort of one thing to think about there of Afghanistan's independence, and that because listening to all this throughout has been Barry Gardiner, Member of Parliament for a London constituency with many people there experiencing the Afghan crisis firsthand. His mailbox has been full. Barry is the chair of Democracy Forum and will now be summing up our discussion and hopefully giving us a way forward. Barry?
Humphrey, thank you very much. I think I've written more notes on this Democracy Forum than on any previous. And it's a testimony to the evidence that we've heard from our speakers today. I thought Lord Bruce started off with giving us really important building block facts. Since August, the dire projections obviously have come to pass. I think taking power is one thing. Running a government is another. And we see this in all of the things that our speakers today have said about the 98% poorly nourished, 9.6 billion frozen, a 30% economic contraction in the economy of the country. He posed a fundamental question, which was posed again and again by different speakers. Do you cooperate or do you denounce? Dr. Christine Fair was extremely blunt, very upfront and I think honest in saying that she saw no obvious way forward. Afghanistan has had more money than the Marshall Plan. The need to focus on sustainability and prepare for withdrawal was never taken seriously enough. and all the foreign subsidies that went to create this rentier state, of course, then collapsed. So again, she posed that question: how to aid the people without bolstering the Taliban government. Timor Sharan picked up that theme. He talked about the current aid effort being a band-aid, not sustainable, and emphasized that people need real jobs as well as what he called privileges. Maybe interesting to explore what those privileges might be. But he was clear that the US needed to show more political will to solve the liquidity crisis, and he didn't see that being resolved anytime soon. Focused on the Taliban need to show their ability to govern, with half the population not able to work or get an education, it's very difficult to see how they are going to be able to do that. Freedom of assembly and expression, he emphasized the bravery of those women demonstrators, absolutely right to talk of that. And on the economic front and collecting revenues, he emphasized the importance of transparency about where that money came from, where it goes, and the need to attack the criminal groups. US cash, he said, must increase, but it was expanding the relief effort. Money flow problems. The previous government relied 40% on external finance. That's gone. Sanctions on the 9.6 billion of frozen cash. The money in the country, much of it illegal, and now people trying to get it out rather than to invest it in the domestic infrastructure. 10% per week permitted withdrawal, again constraining that liquidity in the country, but obviously with the objective of trying to keep as much cash in the country as possible. And in 2001, he said, we gave an image of democracy about the country's possible future, but the Western powers failed to give a realistic economic basis on which that future could be predicated. Lynne O'Donnell, I have to say, huge respect, not only for her fluent eloquence, but also her tenacity in reporting from this country for over 20 years in the way that she's done. She spoke of the revisionism post-NATO withdrawal, about poverty, and really pinpointed the fact that actually things were pretty bad beforehand, and it's extending credulity to say that actually it's been the collapse that has precipitated in totality the difficulties that people in the country are now facing. She spoke about the way in which £1 billion of media money had flooded in between 2010 and 2015 to create that genuine free media in the region, where free press is like an oasis in an otherwise desert landscape. But then really highlighted the way in which that had been eroded and destroyed. And that came after the Trump deal, where the Taliban felt they had not only all they wanted out of the deal, but they had a green light now to go on the attack. And they then launched that renewed campaign against women, against judges, against journalists, pushing journalism out and taking over local radio stations and local media outlets. So taking back all the gains that a free media and a free press had created. I did love her use of the word skerrick, which I confess I had to look up. And I was told by Webster's that it was a chiefly Australian term for a semblance or a trace. But she said that the free media is gone. It is now a skerrick of what it was. So a new word for me there. Thank you for that, Lynne. UN agencies collaborated with the Taliban over polio vaccinations and school curriculum. And I think we began to see some interesting questions about how to secure the money released from the World Bank Trust Fund. I think she said, do your homework. Maybe this was, I think this still was Lynne saying this. Do your homework. Small grassroots organizations are the way of getting real money into the genuine economy without it being siphoned off by the Taliban. And she said, don't give money to the Taliban because they steal it. Dr. Arne Strand again spoke of the humanitarian crisis that was developing under Ashraf Ghani before in the previous regime. A lot of money going in was building military rather than actually creating a real infrastructure, a real economic base in the country. He spoke, I think, importantly about the private sector in Afghanistan needing that liquidity again. Difficult to find out what's going on, but he did point to some areas of light in that less war means supplies can be transported, and those projects of education are happening because of local pressure. And that, I think, is a really interesting comment, that is able to happen at that local level. Primarily a continuation of the previous administration at that regional level, he said, but only with the Taliban superimposed on top now. So the country needs desperately more reconstruction projects and not simply aid dependency. That was, I think, the overwhelming message that came from all of the speakers this afternoon, that aid dependency was not a solution. It had to be real economic reconstruction. But spend it on the people, not on military equipment that you don't need, because Americans left so much behind. I did think that was possibly the quote of the day, and a salutary lesson. So Arne spoke of the reconstruction and development as opposed to the starvation. And the meeting the desperate needs, health needs, and the hunger needs of the people, the food needs of the people. But he also said that Norway's $500 million a year contribution was mostly for aid and not reconstruction and development. And I found that a bit of cognitive dissonance there, because in terms of the Norwegian government, given what he said, I would have thought that he and others in Norway were trying to channel most of that aid into reconstruction and development, but perhaps he could elaborate on that. Jean-Paul Faguet, I thought gave a fascinating overview of the different structures. I did sketch them down, and I think I got the key points here, but I was so relieved when he said that he didn't expect this to be completely understandable because of the lack of time. And I think that was true of the original structures that he outlined. Sorry, that's a bell, which means I will have to go and vote in a minute, but I can finish off before I go. Cleavage theory, I thought, was really fascinating. The political system should reflect the underlying cleavages within society. Left workers, right capital, but it could equally be ethnic and religious fragmentation as well. And here we come up against the politics of identity over and over again. We've seen it here in this country, where the old left-right split broke down over Brexit, where the new cleavage in UK society 5 years ago became, are you a Brexiteer or are you a Remainer? So we've seen this happen. And when that happens, it is deeply destructive of the existing political structure. It also happened, of course, back in East Africa in the 60s and 70s, when we saw the rise of ethnic identity becoming more important in the political structures there, and the refugee crises that took place at that time. What does Afghan society look like, and what sort of democratic structures are designed for it or fit it? And he showed those two very illuminating maps, one of the tribal differences around the regions of Afghanistan, Pashtun, Baloch, and so on, versus the economic lights that you could see from the satellite. And a key point, it needs to map onto something real. So what is the real that it maps onto? What do people want? If you don't know, it's difficult to run a state. If you don't know what people really want, is it equal rights? Is it freedom of speech? Is it basic guarantees? Is it fundamentally just food on the table and a shelter? Or is it something different to that? But it's hard to work with a government that you believe is against who you are against not only your gender, your rights, your identity. And at the center of all this, I think people need to have hope. I'm going to have to go and vote. So, Humphrey, I'll leave it there, but with one
off you go.
recommendation, and that is that there was a publication back in the mid-1980s in the Philosophical Quarterly called Roles on Truth and Toleration. And I do hope that Jean-Paul Faguet may read it and that he may agree that 30-odd years ago, it identified exactly that politics of cleavage that he was talking about and the fragmentation. I must go and vote. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you, Barry Gardiner. Thank you for those thoughts and for summing up our debate. What an incredible debate. Infrastructure, aid dependency, democracy, institutions, and all the rest of it. Next month on the Democracy Forum debate, Wednesday, February the 16th, China's battle for influence in both South and Southeast Asia, can it succeed? We touched on that a bit here. That's February the 16th at 2 o'clock British time with a great panel lineup. Subscribe, read, talk about our sister magazine, Asian Affairs. And until February, thank you, Lord Bruce. Thank you, Barry Gardiner. Thank you, Christine Fair, Timor Sharan, Lynne O'Donnell, Arne Strand, Jean-Paul Faguet, and all of you joining us from all over the world, and the team at Democracy Forum. From me, Humphrey Hawksley. See you next month. Stay interested, stay involved, and stay safe.
Thank you.